hospital bracelet was still on my wrist when he set my bag down on my parents' porch. Not a conversation, not even eye contact. He just placed the bag next to the door, said he'd call me later, and walked back to his car. My mother was standing behind me holding my daughter, 3 days old, still smelling like something I didn't have a word for yet, and I watched his taillights disappear around the corner. He didn't call. Not that night, not the next week, not for a long time after that. I'd met my husband at 26. I was a medical billing specialist at a mid-sized orthopedic clinic in Charlotte, and he was the kind of man who filled a room without trying to. Confident in that quiet way that looks like security when you're young and doesn't look like anything else until much later. His family had money, not flashy money, but the kind that's been sitting in the same place for 3 generations. His father had built a commercial real estate business from scratch in the 80s and turned it into something that didn't need him anymore. His mother had died when he was 16. It was just him and his father, and from what I could tell, they'd spent the last 20 years being polite strangers to each other. We dated for 2 years, got married in a small ceremony in Asheville. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings. He cried a little during the vows, which I think about sometimes now with a kind of exhaustion I can't explain. When I got pregnant, he was happy, or something that looked like happiness. He bought a crib before I was even 12 weeks. We talked about names for hours one Sunday morning, lying in bed with coffee getting cold on the nightstand. He wanted something traditional. I wanted something soft. We never actually agreed. We never agreed on a lot of things, but I didn't understand that yet. The last month of my pregnancy, something shifted. He started coming home later, stopped asking how I was feeling. I'd wake up at 2 in the morning for water and find him still in the kitchen, not on his phone, not doing anything, just sitting there in the dark like he was waiting for something to end. I asked him what was wrong. He said nothing. I asked again. He said he was just tired. 3 days after our daughter was born, he drove us to my parents' house in Concord and set my bag on the porch. I stood there in the November cold with stitches I wasn't supposed to be walking on and watched him leave. My mother brought me inside. My father didn't say anything. He just made tea and sat with me at the kitchen table until my daughter woke up crying and gave us something to do. I blocked my husband's number that same night. I know that sounds strange. Most women would call, would beg, would demand an explanation. But I was 29 years old, holding a 3-day-old baby, and I had exactly enough energy to keep us both alive. I didn't have anything left for a conversation that was going to hurt me and explain nothing. I filed for divorce 3 months later. My lawyer, a woman I found through the Bar Association's referral service because I didn't know any lawyers and I wasn't going to ask my husband's family for a recommendation. She told me to expect a fight over assets. We'd been married 2 years. I had some savings, some 401k, no property. The house was his, the car was mine, the baby was ours, and she was not an asset. He didn't fight, he signed everything. He agreed to pay child support, which he did, reliably, automatically, like a subscription he'd set up and forgotten about. $250 a week, deposited every Friday without fail. He never asked about her, never called to check in, never showed up. My daughter's name is Ren. I named her myself. My parents were good to us. My mother watched Ren when I went back to work at 14 weeks because 14 weeks was all I had. My father quietly fixed up the spare room so it felt less like a guest room and more like a place where a person actually lived. They didn't ask me questions I couldn't answer. They made space. I went back to billing. I asked for a raise 6 months later and got it. I started taking online courses in healthcare administration at night after Ren went to sleep. I was tired in a way that became structural, like it was just part of my architecture now. But I kept going because Ren kept going and she had no choice, so neither did I. It was about 18 months after the divorce that I first met my former father-in-law. I want to be clear about how this happened, because I know how it sounds and I'd rather tell it plainly than have it assumed wrong. Ren had a minor cardiac murmur flagged at her 1-year checkup. Probably nothing, her pediatrician said, but we should have it looked at. I scheduled an appointment with a pediatric cardiologist. The office was 40 minutes away and I had to take a full day off work. While I was in the waiting room, I looked up from my phone and saw him. I recognized him from photos. He was older than I expected, or maybe he'd aged since those photos were taken. He was sitting alone with a paper coffee cup he wasn't drinking, wearing a suit jacket that was slightly too big for him. He looked like a man who had been large once. He saw me at the same moment I saw him. Neither of us spoke for a beat too long. Then he said, "You must be Tess." I said, "Yes, sir." He looked at Wren, who was sitting on my lap tearing apart a paper towel she'd found in my bag because I hadn't brought enough toys. She had his son's eyes. I'd always known that. But I felt it differently in that moment. He said, "Is she all right?" I told him about the murmur. He nodded slowly. He said his own wife had had a similar thing flagged when she was young, and it had resolved on its own by the time she was 5. He said it matter-of-factly, not unkindly. I said, "I didn't know that." He said, "There's a lot you probably weren't told." He meant his son. I understood that. I didn't respond. We sat in that waiting room for another 40 minutes. He was there for a follow-up on something of his own, something cardiac, though I didn't ask for details. Wren charmed him the way 1-year-olds charm everyone by being completely indifferent to the impression she was making. She handed him a piece of her destroyed paper towel at one point, very seriously, and he took it and held it like it mattered. When the nurse called my name, he stood up too. He said, "May I come in? I'd like to, if you'll allow it." I thought about it for a moment. Then I said yes. I don't entirely know why. Maybe because he was her grandfather. Maybe because I was tired of doing everything alone. Maybe because there was something in his face that didn't look like an angle. Wren's murmur was, as expected, almost certainly going to resolve on its own. We were to return in 6 months. The cardiologist was warm and efficient and had a tiny plastic model of a heart on her desk that Wren immediately tried to eat. In the parking lot, my former father-in-law, his name was Walter, which felt strange to use. He stopped beside my car and said, "I owe you an apology I don't have adequate words for. I didn't know what he was going to do. When I found out, it was too late to undo." I looked at him. He looked old and tired and like he genuinely meant it. I said, "Okay." He said, "Can I ask, does she know my name?" I said, "She knows she has a grandfather. I haven't said anything beyond that. She's one." He almost smiled. Fair enough. I didn't hear from him for 2 months after that. Then he emailed me. He got my contact through my divorce attorney, apparently, which my attorney confirmed and said she'd approved. He asked if he could meet Wren, just at a park, somewhere public, whatever made me comfortable. I said yes again. That's the thing I know people will question. Why did I let him in? Why wasn't I guarded, strategic, protected? But here's what I understood about Walter even from that first waiting room. He was not his son. He was a man who had built something real and lost most of the people who were supposed to matter while doing it. And he was standing in a pediatric cardiology parking lot trying to find a way to not lose someone else. I recognized that. I had my own version of it. Over the following year, Walter became part of our routine. Sunday afternoons, usually. Sometimes a weekday if my schedule allowed. He was good with Wren in the way that older men sometimes are. Patient, unhurried, genuinely interested in whatever she was doing. He'd sit on the floor in his nice clothes and stack blocks with her without any apparent self-consciousness about it. He bought her a small rocking horse for her 2nd birthday that he'd clearly put serious thought into. He never once asked me to forgive his son. He never once suggested we reconcile. He never used Wren as a bargaining chip for anything. He was just present. Consistently, reliably present in a way that the man I'd actually married had never been. We started talking during those Sunday visits. At first just surface things, her development, my job, the news, then deeper. He asked me once about my healthcare administration courses, and I explained what I was working toward, and he listened the way people listen when they're actually filing information away rather than waiting for their turn to speak. "You're building something," he said. I said I was trying to. He said, "You remind me of myself at your age, except you're doing it with considerably less help." That was the closest either of us came to talking about his son for a long time. I passed my RH exam, Registered Health Information Administrator, on a Tuesday morning in March when Wren was 2.5. I cried in the car afterward, alone, in the parking garage of the testing center, for about 4 minutes. Then I called my mother, and then I went to pick up my daughter from daycare. I was making $54,000 a year. I had an apartment now, 1 bedroom. Ren slept in the bedroom, and I slept on a pull-out couch that was more comfortable than it looked, because I'd researched pull-out couch mattresses with the same energy I applied to everything else that mattered. I had a car that ran. I had a plan. Walter heard about my certification and took us to dinner to celebrate. It was the nicest restaurant I'd been to in years, and Ren behaved herself with remarkable self-possession for a 2-year-old and spent most of the meal studying the candle flame with scientific focus. Walter ordered a very expensive bottle of wine, poured 2 glasses, and said, "You've earned something nicer than what you're allowing yourself." I said, "I'm allowing myself plenty." He looked at me with something I'd come to recognize as respect. "Yes," he said, "I know. I won't pretend there wasn't a part of this that was strategic. I want to be honest about that, because I think the story is less interesting if I pretend I was purely innocent in it. I understood who Walter was. I understood what his presence in Ren's life could mean for her future. I understood that being someone he trusted and respected was worth something. Not in a transactional way, not like I was calculating percentages, but in the way any sensible person understands that relationships with good people compound over time. But I also genuinely liked him. I found him interesting. He had opinions about architecture and city planning and managed care reform that were entirely his own, and he expressed them with the directness of someone who'd stopped worrying about what people thought of him somewhere around age 60. He was demanding in the way people are demanding when they have standards, not when they have cruelty. When he thought I was wrong about something, he said so. When he thought I was right, he said that too. We were, in some strange way, well matched as people. His son found out about us, about Walter's relationship with Ren, about the Sunday visits, all of it, when Ren was almost 4. Someone in his circle had apparently seen us at the restaurant, or at the park, or somewhere. I don't know the exact mechanism. I know the result. He called Walter. I know because Walter told me without my asking the following Sunday. "He's upset," Walter said. "He wasn't looking at me. He was watching Ren on the swings." I said, "Okay. He thinks I'm—" He used the word manipulated. Walter's jaw tightened slightly. "He seems to believe you sought me out." I said, "I didn't. I know that." He was quiet for a moment. He said he wants to be more involved. I didn't say anything. "With Ren," Walter added, which was unnecessary because we both knew. I looked at my daughter on the swings, her hair coming loose from her braids, shrieking with complete joy at no particular altitude. She was almost 4 years old, and she had never once asked about her father, in a way that suggested she felt the absence as a wound. She knew she had a daddy. She knew he didn't live with us. She'd accepted that with the matter-of-fact equanimity of a child who had never known anything different. She called Walter Pop Pop, and she called my father Grandpa, and she called the world sufficient. I said, "What does he want, specifically?" Walter said, "I think he wants what he didn't bother to want before." That was the most he ever said about his son to me in 4 years, and it was enough. My husband, my ex-husband, showed up at my apartment on a Saturday morning in October. I don't know how he got the address. It wasn't listed anywhere I could think of. I suspect Walter's name was somewhere in the chain and my ex followed it, but Walter denied knowing and I believed him. He knocked. I answered. He was 35 now and looked it in a way he hadn't at 31. His hair was shorter. He was wearing a jacket I recognized from when we were married. He said, "Hi, Tess." I said, "You need to leave." He said, "I just want to talk. I should have done this differently. I know that. I just want the chance to." I said, "You should have called my attorney." He said, "Tess," I said, "my daughter is inside and she doesn't know who you are. You do not get to walk into her morning. Call my attorney or don't call anyone." He stood there for a moment, looking like someone had moved the furniture. I closed the door. I called my attorney that afternoon. She sent a letter that week, reminding him of the existing custody agreement, which granted him visitation rights he had never once exercised, and outlining the legal process for re-engagement. If he wanted to be in Ren's life, there was a path. It involved a family court mediator and a gradual introduction process supervised by a child therapist, which was standard and appropriate and not designed to be punishing but would feel that way to someone who wanted something easy. He never responded to the letter. That was 8 months ago. Walter had a hat episode. Not a full attack, he was specific about this. Not a full attack, Tess, just a conversation my heart was having with me. In February, he was in the hospital for 5 days. I drove Ren to see him on the second day, and she climbed onto the edge of his bed and showed him a drawing she'd made of what she described as a horse that's also a cloud, and he held it with both hands and said it was the best thing he'd ever been given. He's been recovering well. His cardiologist has him on a new medication regimen, and he has a nutritionist now, which he finds undignified but tolerates. He's talking about updating his estate documents, which his own attorney has apparently been asking him to do for years. He mentioned it to me casually one afternoon, the way people mention things they want to say but don't want to make a production of. I didn't respond to the mention. I'm not going to pretend I don't understand what it means, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter. What I will say is this. I have not done a single thing in 4 years with the purpose of placing myself in Walter's estate documents. I built a life. I made a home. I raised a daughter. I earned credentials and a salary and an apartment that is mine, and a pull-out couch that I've since replaced with an actual bed, because Ren has her own room now and so do I. I don't need Walter's money. That's not a performance. That's just true. But Ren is his granddaughter. And if he wants her taken care of in a way that reflects what she's meant to him, what we've meant to each other, this strange little family we built sideways from the wreckage of something else, then I am not going to refuse that on principle. Last Sunday, Walter looked at Ren across the kitchen table. We do Sunday dinners at his house now, have for about a year, and he said, "You know, I used to think I understood what I'd built, what I was leaving behind." Ren was very focused on cutting her chicken into precisely equal pieces. She is 4.5 and extremely precise. He looked at me. "I understand it better now," he said. I poured him more water. I didn't say anything. Some things don't need a response, they just need a witness. My ex-husband never called the attorney back. He never initiated mediation. He never filed anything. He had a window. He always had a window, and he kept not climbing through it, which told me everything I'd ever needed to know about the kind of man he was. Ren asked me last week, while I was braiding her hair before school, whether Pop Pop was her real grandfather. I said yes. She thought about this. Then she said, "Is my daddy Pop Pop's son?" I said yes. She was quiet for a moment, in that specific way she gets when she's arranging information. Then she said, "That's kind of weird." I said, "Yeah, a little." She said, "But Pop Pop is nice." I said, "He really is." She seemed satisfied with that. She went to school. I went to work. And somewhere in Charlotte, my ex-husband is living the life he chose when he picked his bag up from a hospital room and placed it on my parents' porch. And I am living the one I built from what he left behind. And I'll take mine. I think about that parking lot sometimes. The one outside the pediatric cardiology office, grey November sky, Ren on my hip with her paper towel, and this man in a slightly too big suit jacket standing next to my car, saying he owed me an apology he didn't have words for. Nobody was watching. There was no audience. Nobody was going to grade me on how I handled that moment. And I think that's exactly why it mattered. Because the choices we make when no one is keeping score are the ones that actually show us who we are. I wasn't a saint in this story. I want to be clear about that. I understood what building a real relationship with Walter could mean for Ren's future. I held both things at once. Genuine affection and practical awareness, and I don't think that makes me calculating. I think it makes me a grown woman who had been left with a 3-day-old and a bag on a porch and had to figure out how to make something out of that. What I've come to believe is that there's a version of integrity that isn't about being perfectly selfless. It's about being honest. Honest with yourself about what you want. Honest with the people in your life about who you are. Honest in the way you move through difficult situations. I never lied to Walter. I never performed warmth I didn't feel. I never used Ren as a prop. I showed up consistently as myself. And that turned out to be enough. More than enough. The intelligence piece took me longer to understand. Not book intelligence, not credentials, though those mattered too, and I earned them in the dark, on a pull-out couch, while Ren slept. I mean the kind of clear-eyed thinking that says, this situation is what it is, not what I wish it were. My ex-husband was never going to become a different person. Waiting for that, begging for that, building my life around the hope of that would have been the real waste. Understanding reality clearly and moving within it honestly is its own form of strength. It's the kind that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but holds everything else up. And then there's the part that just comes down to getting up. Every single day, 14 weeks postpartum back at a desk. Night courses after bedtime. The RHEA exam on a Tuesday morning. Crying alone in a parking garage, then picking my daughter up from daycare. There is no elegant word for that, it's just endurance. It's just deciding, again and again, that the life you're building is worth the building. My ex-husband had every opportunity. The window was always open, he just kept choosing not to climb through it, and eventually I stopped leaving it open, not out of bitterness, but because the draft was cold, and we had moved on. Ren knows she has a pop-pop who loves her. She knows she has a mother who stayed. She's being raised in a house where actions have weight and consistency means something, where the people who show up are the ones who matter, and the ones who don't show up have already answered the question. That's not a punishment I designed for anyone. It's just what happens when you choose over and over to be someone worth staying for.